Blayne is a doctoral student in religious studies. He passed his comps last year with distinction. He's won a Fulbright Award, Fulbright Hayes, and FLOSS Awards. And if he'd had his Rothers, he would be in Nepal right now. But fortunately for us, he's still here. So without further ado, Blayne, thanks for being here today.
Thank you for that welcome, and thanks to the Center for Asia Research for hosting this time for me to share a bit of some of the research for my dissertation that I've been working on this year with funding from the FLAS. Since I wasn't able to go to Nepal, I've been focusing on looking at the kind of early modern history of Theravada and its influence and conceptions about the Buddhist Holy Land and about how Lumbini fits into that project. And so that's kind of what I'm going to be sharing with you guys today. I've got a PowerPoint. Let's see. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So my talk today is titled Locating Lumbini, Theravada and Modernity on the Frontier of Nepal. And this stretches a couple chapters, some of the content stretches a couple chapters of the dissertation, but it's kind of fresh. I've been working on this chapter this year with some archival materials and doing some research. So just a quick map of Nepal with Lumbini highlighted. So it's right on the border with India. So in the project of, in the project of reclaiming, quote unquote, reclaiming the Buddhist Holy Land in the late 19th and early 20th century, modernist Buddhist activists like Anagarika Dharmapala and others sought to kind of reinvigorate pilgrimage to the biographical sites associated with the Buddha. And so one of these sites is obviously Lumbini, the birthplace in the southern Terai region of Nepal. And here's a kind of brief outline of the late 19th and early 20th century kind of historical moments that kind of characterize the development of Lumbini. So it was rediscovered in 1896. This is a picture of the Ashokan pillar that dates to the 3rd century, or BC, yeah, 3rd century. And this was uncovered by a German Indologist named Anton Furr in 1896 with the help of the Nepalese monarchy. And so most of the period that I'm going to be discussing in the talk today is going to be between this period and 1967, when former UN Secretary General U Thant visited Lumbini on pilgrimage. And then from there on, that initiated a kind of development project that went through various stages in the United Nations, as well as becoming a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1997. So a lot of the focus of this chapter focuses on this kind of notion of Theravada and its connection with modernity. So this is a quote from Christoph Emmerich. From the very beginning of their history in Nepal, Theravada and modernity have been inextricably connected. To speak of Theravada in Nepal is to speak of the modern, of the new, the interrupted, the deteriorated, or the improved. And so these all, as Theravada filtered into Nepal, it became it authored its own kind of language of both new forms of Buddhism, but also of oppositional to older forms of Buddhism already extant in Nepal, as either interrupted or deteriorated. So the two main points of how Lumbini fits into this project, I think, are Lumbini operated first as a central figure in the growth of Theravada in Nepal in the 20th century. So renewed attention by modernist Buddhist activists to Buddhist history and the Buddhist biographical genre, focused on Lumbini as the central point of missionization, of Theravada mission into Nepal. The Dharmadaya Sabha, which was established in the 1940s, became kind of the first institutional form of Theravada reform in Nepal. And they established the first pilgrim rest house there and monastery after in the 1940s. And they also published extensively in both Nepali and Nepal Bhasa, which is the Newar, the language of the indigenous Newar Buddhists, who most of these members from the Dharmadaya Sabha came from those castes. And they published in there about both Lumbini, but other restoration projects about other Buddhist sites in Nepal as well. And then second, Lumbini was manufactured as a UNESCO World Heritage Site amidst these transnational dynamics of modernist Theravada. So in addition to being a focal point for reviving kind of minority Buddhist voices in Nepal itself, it also functioned as a way in these transnational dynamics of Theravada extending between South and Southeast Asia. And this is evident in Nepal's, the Dharmadaya Sabha's initiatives to be a part of the World Fellowship of Buddhists in 1950, 1954, and 1956. And it became a central, in the early 1950s, Lumbini became the central kind of rallying point where the Dharmadaya Sabha was able to elicit help from development initiatives from the Nepal monarchy under King Tribhuvan. And so these kind of dynamics of asserting a kind of state-sponsored Buddhism also played into the kind of model of Theravada Buddhism that was adopted by this community. So here's a brief kind of description of the practice of Buddhism in Nepal broadly. Historically, Buddhism in Nepal has been connected to ethnic identity. Various ethnic minority communities all practice Buddhism, including the Newar, the Tamang, the Sherpa, and then Tibetans. Traditionally, most ethnic Buddhists engage in what are called Mahayana or Vajrayana ritualistic elements. So these include veneration of chaityas containing the Pancha Buddhas, the 5 Buddhas iconography, which can be seen in the pictures that I'll show next. Life cycle and death rituals, recitation of Sanskrit sutras predominantly. So Sanskrit was the predominant scriptural language of these communities, and this kind of starts to change with the intervention of Theravada into Nepal, where these Buddhists, particularly Newar Buddhists, start to cultivate language skills in Pali, the scriptural tradition of Theravada. And then there's other, the Gunla Dharma Festival is one of the major Buddhist festivals that these ethnic minority communities participate in. So these are images from Swayambanath in Kathmandu, which I took in 2019 when I was there. This is the site that's very, probably the most important site to Newar Buddhists in Nepal. And there's a long mythic history about how this site gets established. But these are some of the kinds of iconography and architectural elements characteristic of Newar and more Mahayana and Vajrayana traditions in general. So the Theravada mission into Nepal, particularly at this time, is almost exclusively undertaken by middle caste Newar Buddhists who are a part of the kind of caste hierarchies in the Newar ethnic minority, and they predominantly come from the Vajracharya and the Shakya castes, and this is a householder sangha, as opposed to in Theravada they've adopted a householder sangha as opposed to more strict celibate monastic lifestyles in Theravada. And the priests are hereditary owners of the Buddhist viharas and the patrons of these various chaityas and stupas. And they also serve a kind of a function within the Newar community as a whole to preside over life cycle rites. And they're also charged with preserving these Sanskrit textual traditions. So part of this Newar revivalism that happens in the early 20th century is due to shrinking kind of Buddhist community due to sanctions on the part of the Nepalese monarchy, which sought to the Rana regime, which sought to kind of limit sort of dissonance from the Brahminical orthodoxy that they had established. And so this kind of political reform and the censorship kind of prompted these Newar Buddhists to look for other alternatives outside of Nepal to continue to foster their Buddhist identity. And this also kind of happens in sync with the Dalit movement in India and the independence movement in India, where mass groups of lower caste Indians are converting to Buddhism to be incorporated into independence and these things. So Nepal, these Newar saw this kind of reform, and were actually, many of them were privy to this because they were part of universities at the time in Calcutta, where they saw these kind of independence movements in India on the rise, both in India and in Bengal. And so there's obviously a lot of influence from those kinds of modernist movements as well. Here's some more traditional Newar architecture from the Yasadhara Mahavihara in Patan. And so some of these artistic elements and things are very traditionally Newar, who are traditionally artisans, both wood carvers and metalsmiths, which is evident in these kinds of architectural motifs. So at the time that there's these Newars look, now by the 1920s, there's a sizable group of Newars who are being educated in Calcutta at the universities and other universities in India, and they're coming in contact with, particularly with Anagarika Dharmapala and the Mahabodhi Society. And so Dharmapala's work to reclaim the Buddhist Holy Land, particularly at Bodh Gaya, where he kind of fought a lengthy legal battle to reclaim the site of the Buddha's enlightenment. These Newars were exposed to this kind of rhetoric and actually adopted into the Mahabodhi Society through this kind of these initiatives to not only incorporate Lumbini into this notion of this Buddhist Holy Land, but Nepal as a whole. That Nepal was a Buddhist, had previously been a vestige of Buddhism, and that it needed to be restored to that kind of excellence. Dharmapala himself visited Lumbini in 1899 with the Prince of Thailand. These Theravada activist figures who were working in South Asia, South and Southeast Asia, took a specific interest in Lumbini and its potential for revitalizing Buddhism in Nepal, but also contributing to the kind of Buddhist modernist movement as a whole. And so in a multi-volume article titled Lumbini Restoration Scheme, which was published in the 1922 series of the Mahabodhi and United Buddhist World, the author outlines a whole program for restoring Lumbini to Buddhists and for revitalizing Buddhism in Nepal as a whole. And another important factor, which I'll discuss in even further detail in a second, is that amidst this kind of rhetoric of the Buddhist Holy Land, Dharmapala and the Mahabodhi Society also sponsored and stationed various Theravada monks at the sites, at the Buddhist biographical sites in India, particularly at Kushinagar, the site of the Buddha's passing away, and at Bodh Gaya. And so these Newar Buddhists from Nepal who had left seeking a kind of renewed Buddhism encountered this at the other biographical sites, and then worked to bring that kind of mission back to Nepal at Lumbini specifically. So this is a quote that I from outlining Dharmapala's sentiments from that Lumbini restoration scheme. I think it's pretty sizable to hear Dharmapala's interest in Lumbini and the kind of broader kind of international attention that Lumbini was garnering through the Mahabodhi publications. So the place on which the Asoka pillar stands is holy ground. This is the only site which Buddhists find difficult to visit. It is necessary to have the site cleared, a dharmasala or rest house erected for pilgrims, and a bhikkhu placed there for the guidance of the Sangha. It will be necessary to erect a vihara with a Buddha image installed therein. The whole of the Lumbini site should be set apart for the Buddhists. The Nepal Durbar should allow the Buddhists to rebuild Lumbini. There were buildings in the time of the Lord Buddha. Now the Buddhists have forgotten their holy sites. Steps might be taken if necessary to educate the people who go by the name of Buddhists by the publication of a tract full of information on the sacred site. Every effort should be made to get permission to restore the Lumbini site. So there's this growing in the 1920s and into the 1930s, this growing momentum of international attention to Lumbini as being part of this Buddhist Holy Land, and rightfully the kind of custodianship of that should be given to Buddhists. And so in the midst of this kind of modernist Buddhist rhetoric and activity that's going on, these Newar Buddhists encountered Theravada through, like I said, through these visits, particularly to the visits of the Buddha's passing away at Kushinagara. There they established connections with the Mahabodhi Society, which then gave them avenues to get formal monastic education in the Theravada lineages, and both in Sri Lanka and Burma. And then the kind of central figure in this was Bhikkhu Chandramani, who was a Burmese monk who was stationed at Kushinagara, and pretty much all of the monks and nuns that were initiated from Nepal between 1920 and 1942 were initiated by Chandramani. And so he has this kind of, he's kind of the central pivot figure between these like multiple genealogies of the modernist movement of the Mahabodhi Society, but also of Burmese Theravada monastic lineage. And so these early Nepalese monks and nuns were formulated the Dharmadaya Sabha as the kind of institutional voice of the Theravada movement. And this was officially formed in 1944, although many of these monks were working prior to that in Kathmandu and were actually exiled in the early 1940s. Most of them were exiled from Nepal by the Rana regime as kind of political dissidents. And so they formulated the Dharmadaya Sabha in exile in India. And they modeled this institution on the Mahabodhi Society mandates and that Dharmapala had set forth 60 years earlier. And so actually Chandramani remained the director. He was the director from 1944 to 1972 of the Dharmadaya Sabha, the president of the Dharmadaya Sabha. And so there's this clear kind of Burmese Theravada lineage holder at the head of this Theravada movement in Nepal, which fostered these continue to foster these connections between Burma, but also within the Mahabodhi Society itself, which was operating in India and Bengal and into Sri Lanka as well. A lot of their efforts, they're actually, the Dharmadaya Sabha, many of the early members are actually heralded as important figures in the development of Newari publications or Nepal Bhasa publications, the indigenous language of the Newars. And so they translated a lot of Buddhist texts from Pali sources as opposed to Sanskrit sources into both Nepali and Newari. And they published extensively in several journals called Dharmadaya, the Dharma Kirti, and then Lumbini periodicals. And those reached not just the Newar community, but also other Buddhist communities in Nepal and internationally. They were distributed through the Mahabodhi Society as well. So in 1950 is when we get the first kind of assertion of the kind of 8 points of action of the Dharmadaya Sabha, and this happens at the World Buddhist Conference, Fellowship of Buddhist Conference in Sri Lanka in 1950. And they're listed here, and I think that for the purposes of the talk, the most important one is number 6, to persuade the Nepalese authorities to take the necessary steps to preserve the ancient Buddhist monuments, specifically Lumbini and Kapilavastu. And so this becomes a central tenet of the Dharmadaya Sabha's project in Nepal. But it also goes to show just how significant Lumbini was as a kind of facilitator for Theravada's even emergence in Nepal, right? Because this rhetoric of the Buddhist Holy Land made it so that these Newar converts to Theravada could assert some sort of lineal connection to the Buddha himself. We're true Buddhists because we have Nepal has the birthplace of the Buddha as well, and so we need to reclaim this site. And so much of the early efforts actually of the Dharmadaya Sabha focused on Lumbini, particularly in regards to their presentations to the kind of World Federation of Buddhists, which included Buddhists from South and Southeast Asia as well as East Asia. And so in these conventions that they were meeting, they were advocating that establishing their legitimacy as a sangha, basically as a community, through their ability to, or their custodianship of Lumbini in Nepal, right? So this particularly happened in the 1954 fellowship that happened in Burma. There's a reference that even the Union of Burma Buddhist Sasana Council, which was a UNU era reform movement in Burma to kind of revive the Buddhist Sangha there and reform the Buddhist Sangha. They gifted a large Buddha image to the Lumbini Vihara that had been established by the Dharmadaya Sabha. So now, not only is the rhetoric, is this rhetoric kind of establishing these connections between Burma and Lumbini, but also there's this kind of material patronage of this site, right? This Sangha in this community in Burma has now presented a Buddha image for the shrine room at Lumbini. And then in addition to that, this periodical that was published by the Dharmadaya Sabha also catalogs that several of these prominent Buddhists from the Union of Burma Buddhist Sasana Council actually visited Lumbini on pilgrimage. And so we have this patronage relationship established, but also these pilgrimage networks that had been established in pre-colonial times were now kind of revived through the facilitation of the Mahabodhi Society and the Dharmadaya Sabha, and particularly the Venerable Chandramani. So this is an excerpt from the periodical published by the Dharmadaya Sabha cataloging that was presented for the 1954 Fellowship of World Buddhists. It is gratifying to note that following an appeal made by the Sabha to help restore the sacred birthplace of the Buddha, the Union Buddhist Sasana Council of Burma is taking keen interest in the project. The Honorable U Thien Muang, Vice President of the Council and Chief Justice of Burma, conferred with the members of the Lumbini Dharmadaya Sabha when he made a pilgrimage to Lumbini last year and assured the committee of all possible help from the Union Buddhist Sasana Council. So we start to see that these are images of the proposed Lumbini Vihara, which were published in that same pamphlet. And even the pamphlet's name, which was presented at this 1954 meeting, is Nepal, the birthplace of the Buddha. And so we see this connection strongly established under the Dharmadaya Sabha that Nepal is the birthplace of the Buddha, and that the Dharmadaya Sabha has custodianship over this Buddhist site. And these are renderings of the layout of the Vihara that the Dharmadaya Sabha commissioned. So the central, one of the central figures, Nepalese figures that converted to Theravada is the Venerable Anuruddha Mahatera. And he was born Gajaratna from the Tuldar merchant Newar caste in 1915. And his father actually, Dasratna, became a monk after him, taking the name Dharmaloka, and they both were kind of championing the cause of Lumbini, with both of them spending numerous years at Lumbini, residing at the Vihara. Particularly Anuruddha becomes the abbot of the Vihara upon his return from Burma, where he was ordained, or received higher ordination. And he served there until 1991, where he then returned to Kathmandu to serve as the abbot of Anandakuta Vihara, which is the central Theravada Vihara in Kathmandu. It's located at Swayambhunath, which I showed pictures of before. And so this was kind of the central operating hub of the Theravada mission in Kathmandu. And so he goes from Lumbini to there and resides there until his death in 2003. In 1998, he was named the third Sangha Nayaka, which is the Patriarch of Nepal, both by the Nepal Bhikkhus Association and the Prime Minister of Nepal. So he's this kind of central figure in establishing strong monastic connections to Burma as well, because he spent 10 years there studying both Burmese and Pali Buddhist literature, and so he was fluent in Burmese when former Secretary General U Thant visited in 1967, and all the communications regarding the development of Lumbini at that time from the late 1960s onward happened through the Dharmadaya Sabha, particularly through Anuruddha. And so here's a stupa at the Theravada monastery at Lumbini, honoring Dharmaloka, who is Anuruddha's father, and Anuruddha. And these actually, because I didn't, when I was there in 2019, I wasn't able to get access here to take pictures. My friend who I'm working with who works for the Lumbini Museum, the new Lumbini Museum that they're building, sent me these pictures in January. And so I think it shows the kind of the importance of Lumbini as a site for establishing Theravada in Nepal. So three kind of main concluded points is that central to the Theravada reform movement in Nepal was this awakening to Nepal's place in Buddhist history, right? And this happens through the kind of modernist ideas espoused by the Mahabodhi Society, but also through just through this this desire to for the cultivation of kind of ethnic identity under the kind of strict political environment of the Rana regime, that there is this revivalist Newar movement that wants to accentuate its Buddhist identity, and so this fits really well with this kind of Mahabodhi logic of reclamation, of restoration, of being part of a broader Buddhist community, not just a ethnic minority in your own country, but as part of a broader international, transnational Buddhist community. Under the Dharmadaya Sabha, pure Buddhism, that is Theravada, was interlinked with the custodial rights to Nepal's Buddhist monuments. So it's not just that Buddhism was kind of on the rise at Lumbini at this time. It's said no, like Theravada was the central motivator for the development of Lumbini at that time. They're the ones who championed this call, these Theravada reformists, and a large part they're still connected to the development of Lumbini. The Vihara where I showed you these pictures come from is actually the closest to the Mayadeva temple and the Asoka pillar. It's the earliest built. And so under King Tribhuvan, who due to political contestation, other things, only really served from 1951 to 1955, where he, during that time, at least 1951, 1955, he actually championed this kind of rhetoric of Dharmadaya Sabha, right? He engaged this, and he supported the Buddhist, the kind of Theravada reforms that were happening. He was central figure in allowing the Dharmadaya Sabha to be established at Anandakutta Vihara. He also supported the various relics that came from Sri Lanka to Kathmandu in the early 1950s that he patronized as well. They were brought to the palace. And so this connection in this brief time, the Dharmadaya Sabha used this connection with King Tribhuvan and his court to really establish themselves as the kind of the voice of Buddhism in Nepal. But then following China's annexation of Tibet in the late 1950s, the Dharma Daya Saba became one of multiple Buddhist voices in Kathmandu, right? As these Tibetan refugees kind of poured into Nepal, as well as other kind of ethnic minority revival movements, there became multiple Buddhist voices, particularly in Kathmandu, right? Where these kind of voices converged. But the Dharma Daya Saba really, it essentially retained this kind of lasting presence at Lumbini, where these other communities had not established those connections, right? And so Theravada, under the Dharma Daya Saba, is kind of institutionally it's institutionally rooted at Lumbini, and Lumbini also functions as this this mediator of these kind of modernist ideas about the Buddhist Holy Land to filter into Nepal. Here's some pictures from when I was there in 2019 as well. The Mahadeva Temple and the courtyard area where the archaeological ruins are, as well as the World Heritage Site plaque, which I think is significant because this notion of World Heritage really fits well with the Buddhist, this kind of international Buddhist mission, right? To claim these sites as not just under the custodianship of local governments or local sanghas, but for all Buddhists, right? And this, the UNESCO expands this to all humanity, but this really fits quite nicely with the genealogy of modernist Buddhism in the early 20th century into the mid 20th century, and kind of a central component of that is the pilgrimage of UN Secretary General U Thant, who visited Lumbini, as far as the records show, the historical records show, for only a couple hours. He took a helicopter from Kathmandu and was only there for a couple hours. And in that time, he reportedly met with Anuruddha Mahatera, and there's not much, even in Anuruddha's biographies, about what was actually discussed, but no doubt the Anuruddha's familiarity with Burma, having fluency in Burmese, helped facilitate that connection. And they exchanged a series of letters between 1967 and 1971, in which the real development initiatives were undertaken by U Thant and his close staff to really develop Lumbini into a site of world peace. U Thant envisioned this place in the middle of the Cold War as a place where not only Buddhists could come together, but all people could come together to facilitate world peace. And this notion of world peace is also repeatedly referenced in the continuing construction of Lumbini in Nepal, and how the Dharma Daya Saba in particular, as well as the Lumbini Development Trust, which has taken over development of the site since the 1980s, how they envision Lumbini and how they market Lumbini to the pilgrims and global and tourists. And so this notion of world peace plays a heavy factor in connecting both the kind of UN mission, but as well as this kind of international Buddhist philosophy. And between 1967 and 1971, U Thant worked with multiple communities, Buddhist sanghas from around Southeast Asia, East Asia, to really gain support to develop the site. And this kind of was articulated through a kind of modern development plan that was designed by Kenzo Tange, a famous Japanese architect. And that plan was signed off on in 1972, but it wasn't really initiated until 1978 after U Thant's death. But since 1978, the development plan has taken kind of center stage, and there's various debates on whether it's been completed or what funding issues and various controversies. But that's, I think, beyond the scope of the talk here, and that's kind of more later chapters in the dissertation and what I'm hoping to work on more while I'm in Nepal. But I think it's clear that we can see these established connections between Theravada's emergence in Nepal and Lumbini as a site, as going from an archaeological excavation with very little interest by the Nepal government to a central site and ultimately a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1997. In 2019, there was a statue erected for U Thant, which commemorates his pilgrimage and his the development initiatives. There's all of these connections between him and Anuruddha, who was the abbot of the Dhammadaya Sabha Vihara there. And so these are some of the kinds of archival documents that I've been going through from the UN, detailing their conversations. And there's this real strong emphasis, because not only was U Thant he was the Secretary General of the United Nations, he was the most, the highest position in the UN, but Anuruddha really appealed to him as a Buddhist in these development initiatives, and that comes through in the language of the letters, and is really kind of in line with this modernist international transnational kind of project of Theravada, and of modernizing of these the Buddhist Holy Land. And here's the Lumbini master plan as it sits as of summer 2018, and the kind of layout and so at the time that most of these that the Dhammadaya Sabhas really taking foothold of in the development of Lumbini is this circular area, the sacred garden is really kind of all that's there, right? And the rest has been built since 1978 under the development plan, with a lot of excavation and diversion of water sources and such to facilitate. And then here's the Burmese Vihara, which goes to establish these later, these continued connections between Burma and Lumbini. There are sites from 42 different Buddhist communities. And so, but I think it's based on the what I've discussed so far. I think the Burmese complex is actually a very extensive complex, including rest house for pilgrimage, as well as the pagoda here. So you can see the kind of continuation of these investments by the Burmese Sangha at Lumbini.
Well,
that's all I have for now.
Thank you, Blayne. That was wonderful. Very rich presentation. I really enjoyed that a lot. At this point, let's open it up for Q&A. Any questions from the audience?
I have a question. Sorry, go ahead, Anne.
Go ahead.
I have a more of an unrelated question, more about the whole movement, the Dalit movement with Ambedkar. Did they help at all with the future of Lumbini and the progress towards making it a center of the Buddhist movement?
As far as the archival materials I've come across and everything, and the research that I've done so far, I haven't seen any super strong connections as far as the Dalit movement actually partaking in the development project. They're happening kind of contemporaneously. A lot of the students that, like I said, these Newar students who were in India, who had by the 1920s, were certainly familiar with some of the actors and in the same circles as some of the actors who were a part of it. I think that, and they certainly influenced the kinds of desires for articulating a kind of new Buddhist Newar identity in Kathmandu specifically, but as far as at Lumbini, I haven't seen any kind of material or historical, strong historical connections.
Shall I?
Please.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I had a kind of similar question, but then a different question as well. The similar question was about what kind of rank are the Vajracharya and Shakya castes that you say were the more old-fashioned Buddhists in Nepal. But more than that, I'm trying to get my mind around the Nepali government's attitude toward Buddhists and Buddhism before the story that you're talking about took place. I mean, I think you mentioned that the Nepali government either opposed Newar Buddhists or weren't very interested.
Yeah.
So if you could tell us a little more about that and why.
Yeah, that's a great question. So multiple parts. So there's this kind of continuing tensions, but also various degrees of support by certain leaders as they took office under the Rana regime. Like this all happens under the Rana regime in Nepal, and in the late 19th century, there are 1880s, 1890s, there are Newar Buddhists who are leaving Nepal for merchant jobs in Bengal, in India, in Burma, because they were extremely well trained and gifted artisans, and so along these, part of these kind of waves of expatriate Newaris is the tensions from the Rana regime that are not particularly. There's a breakdown in the traditional patronage of these communities and these sites within Kathmandu, which relied on these previously had relied on these princely states, these 4 princely states in Kathmandu, to patronize these sites and these communities. When the Ranas take over, those patronage structures start to deteriorate. At various times they're okay, and at various times they're very bad. And so you get these waves of people, these Newars already leaving. Up until in the early part of the 20th century, there is this, and broadly, the Rana regime had a kind of isolationist attitude towards British colonialism as well. And they wanted to remain independent. They had, they had interactions with various officials, and there was a colonial official stationed in Kathmandu, but it was never formally colonized, right? And part of that agreement was in the treaties that were signed were the Gorkha regiments were allowed to fight under the British Indian government, right? But in the 1920s, the Rana regime starts to loosen some of these isolationist kind of ideas, realizing that they need to educate their own bureaucrats and they need to kind of modernize, and so they start sending them to India. And this is where this wave of these Newar, usually young men, get sent to Calcutta and other parts of India to study at university, right? Because they didn't have their own university in Kathmandu until, I think the first one was 1920, 1918, 1922, something like that. And so there's this, at the time where they're cutting off all of these patronage ties to these Buddhist communities. They're also sending these young men to go get educated, right? So there's this kind of idea that they need to modernize their own citizens to fill these bureaucratic positions. But as far as religion is concerned, there's this there's a heavy kind of Brahminical kind of orthodoxy that the Rana regime implements, and so what ends up happening with these Newar communities is they end up starting to just so there's Newar castes, and then there's also the way that the Rana regime structured castes, right, and the Nepalese government structured castes. So under those castes, the Vajracharya and the Shakyas are the priestly kind of castes of the Newar community, and they largely kind of fell into this priestly role under the Rana regime as the priests for the Newars, right? And they let them kind of do their ritual practices and all of the same things under the kind of the suggestion that you wouldn't really push back too much against the status quo. But in that, there's the Tuildars and other middle caste Newars that are right underneath the Shakya. Even many of the Shakyas actually left and that becomes part of the rhetoric too, is that their name is tied to the Buddha. He was the prince of the Shakya caste, and so this becomes rhetoric as well. But I think it's a really ambivalent relationship up until King Tribhuvan regains the throne and has only a short period before he mysteriously dies abroad. And his son, even Mahindra, for a year or two, Mahindra actually sponsored some of the Dharmadaya Sabha initiatives too, following Tribhuvan's lead, and then that kind of reverts back to more a kind of rejection of the kind of state-sponsored patronage. Well, there was it was still allowed, like the Dharmadaya was still allowed to have a headquarters in Kathmandu, but there was no longer this close connection to the monarchy. And so, yeah, I think it's a turbulent kind of relationship between, and it depends on also how visibly Buddhist you are, how visibly Hindu you tend to be, how you negotiate that relationship in public, because a lot of Newar Buddhists who are traditionally Buddhists stopped asserting that identity in those periods and tried to fall underneath the as closely as possible, fall underneath the kind of mandates of the Brahminical orthodoxy.
So they stopped calling themselves, they stopped thinking of being Buddhist as being a kind of person. That is, I mean, you only use the word Hindu at the end there.
Yeah.
Were the kings Hindu? And
yeah, well, yes, I mean that, yeah.
Okay.
And this is a complicated relationship too, because there's this connection between the kings and Vishnu and things like that. And so there's these a lot of taboos surrounding, like, even Tribhuvan's patronization of the Dharmadaya Sabha and these Buddhist relics, which are reported in these documents from the Dharmadaya Sabhas. Like, Tribhuvan and his entourage picked them up and brought them to the palace and had them there overnight. And then they were installed at the Dharmadaya Sabha, right? Which didn't happen under the Rana regime, as far as I can tell, right? So there's this, yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Professor Nyapana?
Thank you. Thank you, Blayne. This is an interesting presentation. I'm from Nepal, and I'm in the Watts College of Public Service and Community Services at ASU. And I actually grew up not too far from Lumbini. south northwest of Lumbini, probably 40, 50 miles northwest. And I visited Lumbini when I was in 8th grade on a school field trip. And there was nothing back then, just the Maya Devi temple, and nothing was there. And I visited Lumbini a few times, actually quite a few times since then. And I do some work in Lumbini as well, but I'm not a religious scholar. My work is mostly heritage, tourism, community development, those areas, and publish few papers. One thing I'm wondering is there any tension between Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism? Because when you look at the new site, the development site, there's one side is Mahayana monasteries, and the other side is Theravada monasteries. And Theravada monasteries, there are fewer Theravada monasteries than the western side. So I was just wondering, if you know any tension between these two groups.
Yeah, that's a great question. As far as I know, there's not particularly tension. Part of this that happens with the Kenzo Tange plan as well is that there's this very very modern logic of how this place gets laid out, right? Like it gets sectioned into 3 zones, and those zones then have separate functions, right? And so even in U Thant's initial proposal that he drafted actually for the UN committee that he founded within the UN, the Lumbini Development Committee in 1970, he has already in there this vision of a monastic zone, but divided into an east and a west, right? To be Theravada and Mahayana. And so I think part of this is kind of a scholarly imposition that has been adopted into kind of modern parlance about the divisions between Mahayana and Theravada, right? That these are drastically separate traditions and that they don't have any kind of lit crossovers or anything. But I think the case of the Newar community is evident that actually these traditions are not just simply Mahayana or Theravada, right? And so I think part of that division also allows for kind of separate, less interaction between those two communities, but also separate kind of practice, right? Like you'll see there's different Mahayana practices or Vajrayana practices taking place in the temples and the monasteries on the western side as opposed to, and it allows on the eastern side. And so I think it allows for a kind of, in the way that it was envisioned, it allows for a kind of like a piece of that nation, right? So like the Burmese Vihara is like stepping into a Burmese Vihara in Burma, right? Or the Sri Lanka Vihara is like stepping into the same, and this is why they wanted to see all of these different architectural motifs too, right? To allow these Buddhist communities to kind of come together at one place, but in a systematic way, right? And if you contrast this to other places, right, like in India, like at Bodh Gaya or at Kushinagar, the development is much more sporadic, and there's not this stark division between like East and right, Mahayana and Theravada. You have a Chinese monastery right next to the Theravada monastery in Bodh Gaya, right? In Bodh Gaya, there's 5 Thai Theravada monasteries, each representing a different community or right from Thailand, but they're not structured in the same kind of like the division. And so I think the division itself creates this kind of it reinforces this kind of division between Mahayana and Theravada in the kind of modern mentality about Buddhism as a whole, that there's these separate traditions. And certainly there are different practices and there's different kind of cultural instantiations of those traditions, but that's, a lot of the discourse about Lumbini in recent has been like, well, it doesn't actually create like an ecumenical space, right? Because they're so divided, right? There's Theravada over here. And even within the communities, they're like gated off, right? So you have like the Burmese kind of Vihara and complex that's gated off from the Sri Lankan one that has its own gates, from the Thai, from the Cambodian. And so I think part of that has to do with the way that this plan was designed, as opposed to actual on the ground tensions between the communities. Because as far as I can see in my visits there, the Mahadeva, even though this is not how UNESCO designed it, right? The Mahadeva, the sacred garden area actually becomes that mixing zone between these communities, right? You'll see Theravada monks meditating. You also see Mahayana monks there doing practice, right? And so all in the same kind of space, even though that's supposed to be the historical site, right? Like that's supposed to be kind of marked off as separate from the monastic zone. So
Thank you.
I hope that answers, yeah.
Professor Rush?
Yes, hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. So thanks, Blayne. That was fascinating, terrific. So I have a question. So you described this movement repeatedly as modernist, modern, and a reform movement, right? And yet, what you've been talking about are kind of attention to, obsessions with holy sites, viharas, relics, pilgrimages. What's modern about any of that?
It's a good
For
question.
example, let me just pursue this one thing a little bit more. So, is there anything modern or modernist or reform-minded in teachings, for example, or attitudes about social issues? Did the Mewars, for example, vocally abandon caste? Have they changed their positions or thoughts about the role of women in their societies? That's my question.
Those are phenomenal questions. Yes, to all the. So the reason I categorize this Theravada movement as modernist, following Sarah Levine and David Geltner, who work in Nepal as well, who call it a modernist movement, particularly because, yes, they do this Theravada movement denounced caste. It also tried to instantiate the traditional monastic lineages, which are celibate monastic lineages, as opposed to this householdered sangha that of the Vajracharya and the Shakyas, who are presiders over the priestly presiders over the viharas in Kathmandu. They were also renunciate a lot, which is not necessarily modernist, but if we're taking modern to be novel and new in Nepal, certainly was new in Nepal. These Theravada monks preaching on the streets was certainly new, at least for 500 years, at least 500 years. And they also had a sizable population of nuns that were a part of this community as well. So Christoph Emmerich and Sarah Levine have talked about both Burmese not missionizing to Nepal from Burma, but also Newar women leaving Kathmandu to go to Kushnagara and then be facilitated to Burma to be initiated, not as nuns, but as initiates, and then returned back to Nepal and started their own communities there. So some of those kinds of elements of the movement certainly make it modernist. Mm-hmm. What I mean when I say modernist as far around Lumbini is that there was nothing there prior to the Mahabodhi, prior to colonial and Mahamodi intervention. And so it's new for Nepal to have a site developed in such a way as Lumbini. And it was new for India as well. When the Mahabodhi started to reclaim these sites, right? Particularly Bodh Gaya was a site of a Shivite temple for 500 years or so. And there was a huge lengthy legal battle over that, right? Because under this kind of notion of reclamation and transnational kind of connection between parts of South and Southeast Asia and East Asia, there's this resurgence of kind of international connectivity. That yes, there are certainly, many scholars have talked about various trade routes and other sorts of patronage connections between South and Southeast Asia. But those connections were extinct in Nepal, at least for like 1,000 years, as far as the archaeological records. And in a lot of places at Buddhist sites in Nepal and India as well. And so what is modernist about this is that it's these groups, these activists like Anagarika Dharmapala, articulate their mission as Buddhists as a whole, not just as Sri Lankan Buddhists, as like we need to reclaim these places, right? And so it broadens the scope of these. Yeah, pilgrimage is important in a lot of Buddhist cultures, and relic veneration is extremely important in a lot of Theravada cultures, but those happen predominantly happen in local regions, as opposed to this broader attention to Lumbini specifically, which hadn't happened in Nepal for 1,000 years.
Thank you.
Yep.
Juliana, please.
Mute.
Sorry, you're muted. Sorry.
Let me suggest another lens to look at these developments of modern Theravada as being a network that's intersecting rather than discrete, isolated genealogies or lineages. We like to think of Theravada as being determined by lineages. That's the world I grew up in as an academic, but I think the world you live in, Blayne, is one that explores those interconnections, okay? Along those lines, for example, when the Burmese in the 1950s would speak or think of Lumbini, it was a relationship between Burma and Lumbini, and no one else was there. In fact, no other Buddhists could possibly be engaged in this missionizing effort to reconstruct Lumbini. It was a Burmese effort. It was a national revitalization of Burmese society and politics under UNO. Okay. At the same time, for example, you talk about the Nevar as positioning themselves as Theravada vis-a-vis other Buddhist groups. So Theravada becomes an identity that you can position in a particular context. And I can think of other situations where that is the case. But if you look at if you look at Lumbini from the point of view of Lumbini, then you see that there are these rather artificial attempts at a Buddhist ecumenical, universal, modern plan that's good for humanity, good for UNESCO, and has never existed before, right? So those are very different understandings of Lumbini in time and place. And I think part of the fascination with the place is precisely that deliberate construction. That was a modernist project, so to speak, to construct Lumbini in these multiple dimensions. So I think that's what makes it so fascinating. And I think you're on the way to writing a real super dissertation. And so I can't wait till it's done.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I know it's past the time. If I could ask one more question, if people don't mind. I want to look at the future of the movement per se and kind of compare where the Hindu revival movement has gone, for example, with the Ayodhya movement, or the Sikh, folks, wanting to rebuild their sacred lands in Pakistan, and the Pakistani government being open to that. Where do you see this moving forward with both Nepal and India? being non-Buddhist majority, while Burma, Sri Lanka, Thailand want to create these sacred places in the lands of India and Nepal.
Yeah. So this is going to be probably the concluding chapter of the dissertation, but just to sketch out kind of where it's headed. Part of this, and kind of where my ethnographic research fits into with what's going on there contemporarily. This movement that I've discussed about Newar conversion to Theravada actually has positioned itself, as Yuliana said, against these Vajra, not necessarily against, but has been counter-positioned to these priestly castes of Vajrayana and Shakya, predominantly Vajracharya caste, who have now started their own kind of Newar revival of their own, right? And so they just recently built a Vihara at Lumbini in 2018, which the scholar Todd Lewis works really closely with that community, and he's been a part of how they kind of facilitate that. But from my talks with them and from him, they hadn't built a Vihara in like 400 years, so they actually had to like go and find how they would build their own place there, right? And part of that, and like how they go about like just constructing the Vihara, but also part of that is that they weren't really since 2015, when Nepal underwent democratization and became a democratic republic, and the Hindu monarchy there was 10 years of civil war, but these avenues have now been open to these Buddhist minority communities, right? Not just Newars, but also Tamangs and Sherpas to potentially participate at Lumbini in ways that they were never afforded to prior to that, right? What gives the Dharmadaya Sabha some legitimacy is that they were political, patronage legitimacy, is that they were supported for that brief time by King Tribhuvan, who's really revered throughout the country for a lot of his efforts. And so they kind of established themselves, they kind of beat the other communities to the game of establishing themselves as a kind of institutional voice for Buddhism. But it's a particular voice, as Dr. Schober said, that they crafted to be Theravada, right? And so now you have this, amongst the Newar community, you have more traditionalist Vajracharya who want to retain their Newar Buddhist identity and who are reconstructing that textual lineage, or trying to catalog that textual lineage through the Sanskrit kind of Mahayana textual tradition. And then you have this Dharmadaya Sabha and these other Theravada organizations that are also trying to establish not only that they're like legitimate, like Nepalese Buddhists, but also that they like have a spot they should have a spot at Lumbini, right? Because the development project has been so internationally focused since U Thant's intervention, where he solicited all the support, financial support, but also moral support from all of these, from Japan, from China, from all of these places that have now built these giant temples there. But there's really hasn't been a focus on, okay, how do we get these communities from these Buddhist minority communities from Nepal to participate in that project as well. And so I think that's where the movement's going. And that's kind of what I'm working. So I'm doing some research with the new director of the Lumbini Museum, who herself is a Newar woman who is really trying to tell just even the history of Lumbini through artifacts and through the museum in a way that sheds light on this kind of the plurality of Buddhist voices in Nepal currently. And so that's hopefully where the direction of my research is going, and to look at the possibilities of how this plays, and then to hopefully be there doing ethnographic fieldwork with these communities as they try to engage in this development plan.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Any other last call for questions? And so if not, then we look forward
Thank you so much
to
for having me.
continuing
I have a short
our
I have a short
conversations.
question. I'm sorry.
That's
think
fine. Don't
I-
apologize.
Okay, so I remember that you had a really compact quote in the beginning. It kind of shaped the conversation really well. So I just want to like, I'm just hoping that you can revisit that quote and kind of explain it to you know,
Okay.
to remind people how I forgot his name, like how his research can connect to your research.
Yeah. So the quote's from Chris Emmerich, and it appeared in an article he wrote for edited volume recently. And I think it frames the conversation of, particularly of this discussion, but also I think of the way I approach the no. PowerPoint.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah. And so even though I think this speaks to the kind of multiple genealogies and the intersecting of genealogies that Dr. Schober talked about, is that Theravada is relatively new in Nepal itself. It may be a very old tradition in other parts of the world, particularly South and Southeast Asia, but even recognition of of Pali sources as predating Sanskrit sources is something that was hugely new to these Newars as they sought to leave Kathmandu and find other kinds of ways of articulating Buddhist identity, right? And so it's not just that this is all new, but it's also that, like he said, like Emmerich says, of the interrupted, the deteriorated, or the improved, right? And so here we get this notion that like Theravada is older, therefore it's more authentic, and we need to return to that. It's been deteriorated throughout history, and we need to return to it. We need to restore it, or it improves and in a lot of cases, this was the rhetoric. It improves Buddhism in Nepal, in amongst Newars, because look at all of this social, like Dr. Rush's question. I think this is what speaks. It got rid of, like, no, the Buddha didn't approve of caste. So how can you be Buddhist and be a Newar practicing under these caste guidelines, right? No, because look, if we read these documents, the Buddha didn't approve, right? And so there's this, we need to improve our own tradition. We need to renew our own tradition. And so this is kind of the logic that gets operationalized in the not only of Theravada into Nepal, but also of just the idea of Lumbini as part of this Buddhist holy land, right? Because so much of the landscape of Newar Buddhism is condensed in the Kathmandu Valley. Not that they didn't go on pilgrimage to other places, and that'll be in the chapter previous to this, where I talk about kind of pre-colonial pilgrimage and stuff. But Lumbini doesn't feature heavily until there's a gap where Lumbini doesn't really feature at all, between the Malla period and kind of the late 19th century. And that's because these sites in Kathmandu were so much more significant to the Newar population than these sites beyond that. So.
All right, well, thank you very much, Blayne. Thanks for a great discussion today, and thank you all for contributing your perspectives and your questions. It's been wonderful to have you here, and nice to see everybody, and have a good weekend.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, Blayne.